Today, Christmas Eve of 2025, democracy in the world is under threat in a way we have never before seen it. I was recently up in Oslo for the Nobel Week, and in the forum there, the expert on the panel said that democracy in the world has not been receding this much in many measures. And he didn't say since the 1930s. He said it's worse than in the 1930s. And since we know that democracy is only a post-World War I phenomenon, basically, it means it's the worst in our era. Last time we had a lot of democracies in the world was in antique Greece. So we could say we are at the worst time since antique Greece. So what can we do about it? Well, in order to understand why it's come to this point, we have to start with an analysis. And that's why I'm going to make a series of videos about this topic. So let's go back. How did this start, the present wave? Because after World War II, we got a lot of new democracies, but this And obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the communist bloc collapsed, we got a lot of new democracies in Europe. So we have more democracies now than we had in the 1930s. That's not the thing. The thing is how they are, democracy as a governing form is on its heels, backsliding, sliding into autocracy and fake elections. That's the problem. A lot of countries call themselves democratic while they're not. So how did this wave start? Well, after the collapse of the communist bloc, two countries survived. North Korea and Cuba. And in the 1990s, two more countries slid into dictatorship. Russia and Venezuela. Now, many of you may react, Venezuela. Well, actually, we didn't really see how bad it was until about 10 years after, because the process is gradual. And a lot of people didn't notice that Venezuela had become a dictatorship until, well, after 2010. It was really when Nicolas Maduro had taken over from Hugo Chavez and people started protesting, that there was a lot of repression, and that's when you notice that it's a dictatorship. In the case of Venezuela, in 1999, Hugo Chavez took power after having been duly elected in 1998, but he threw out the constitution. He changed the constitution in an unconstitutional way. So the coup d'etat in Venezuela was really in 1999. And then there were large protests against this in 2002 when he fired all the professionals, the meritocracy in the state oil company, PDVSA, in order to convert that oil company into a political tool for his agenda. And that's when about 1 million people took to the streets in Caracas to protest that. He met that protest. He used force to beat down that protest. The military refused, but he had civilians, government employees in civilian clothing, who shot and killed 19 and injured over 100. And when this was broadcast on TV, there was a countrywide uproar, which forced President Hugo Chavez to resign. But the military reinstated him 2 days later under General Baduel. And this, the regime then painted internationally as a military coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez. But it was the opposite. There you see the power of propaganda. If you look at this in Wikipedia, it will say that there was a military coup. It's a lie. It was a non-violent, popular protest met with violence that forced Hugo Chavez to resign. And he was then reinstated by the military in what really was a military coup. And they turned it backwards. The film about that is called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And that is one huge, tremendous, galactic propaganda lie. There was an analysis of that called X-Ray of a Lie. That documentary has almost no views, and the propaganda has probably hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of views. So there you start to see how this could happen. People in the West have been brainwashed by propaganda to believe in the lie and not in the truth. And then this method of taking over countries has been spread to other countries. In South America, they did it in other countries like Ecuador, but in Ecuador and Brazil and other countries, the democratic interchange of president did not stop. So it was possible to get them out again. In one country, though, it was deemed necessary by the Supreme Court to order the arrest of the president, Manuel Zelaya, on June 28, 2009. When he disobeyed a direct order from the Supreme Court. The court ordered him not to hold the illegal, unconstitutional referendum that he wanted to hold about changing the constitution. So the court issued an arrest warrant for him, the military arrested him, and the world called it a military coup. So there we have case number 2. When the democratic institution, in the case of Honduras, and the people, in the case of Venezuela, defended their democracy, the world called it a military coup. So now I think you see the pattern. Democracies are failing because they are unable to defend themselves. And the reason why is not because people don't take to the streets or because the judicial system is not working. No, the reason is that they cannot confront the propaganda from the autocracies. In the United States, for instance, it's forbidden by the government to emit propaganda to the own people. They are unable, their hands are literally tied behind their backs. So an enemy like Russia or Venezuela can fill the airwaves in the United States with propaganda, and the government in Washington cannot do anything about it. That is the reason why it's failing. In other countries, like here in Europe, where there is an effective public broadcasting organization, the autocracies have taken another beat. They have infiltrated these public broadcasting organizations with people who are thinking like them, and therefore they don't need to tell them what to say, they are thinking like them. So a lot of what you can read and see is actually propaganda lies, and it has been for about 20 years, maybe 25. That is the reason why democracies are failing. So the first thing we need to do is to get the truth out there. And here in YouTube, I'm making this for YouTube. When we take the case of Venezuela, for instance, and in English now, you see, the problem is in English, in the United States, that the Spanish-speaking community and the English-speaking community do not have the same news. The news don't travel between the two communities. I lived in Miami and I saw that not even within the same house, the Miami Herald building, did the news travel from one floor to another. The Spanish-speaking and the English-speaking versions of the newspaper had different stories. That's how bad it is. The Spanish-speaking community in the world knows what's going on in Venezuela but the English-speaking does not. The English-speaking is dominated by the propaganda lie. So when I look here on YouTube, I get a lot of videos now when Trump is taking action, analyzing this from the point of view of an American, US American perspective, not a Venezuelan perspective. And here we have the problem that to understand what's going on in the world, one way of approaching it is try to get to the truth. But the truth is very complex and nobody is acting based on the truth. That's a fact. Everybody is acting based on his own view of the truth. So it's not really relevant. In order to understand what's going on, it's not really relevant to try to look at what the absolute truth is. But we have to look at who are the actors, which are the actors, which countries, and which presidents, and which foreign ministers, etc. And which guerrilla groups, who are the actors? And what point of view does each one of these actors have? And then we can start to understand why the world is moving the way it does. So I will get into that next. But this video now I'm going to finish because I don't want to make too long videos. But subscribe, put on notifications, and follow my channels because I will continue to inform about this. And who am I? I'm a doctor in geography. I've lived about 20 years in Miami, in little Venezuela. I know the situation, the political situation in the United States quite well, after having been in presidential campaign there. And I know the situation in Venezuela very well, after having been active in the opposition resistance against the dictatorship for, well, I would say I've followed the case in Venezuela since 2009. So, see you next video, and thank you for watching. And please share to your friends also, because it's very important to get the truth out there.